Yes. Thank you all for coming here. This is really a wonderful thing. I know. Eric, I'm sorry. Eric, go ahead, man. Do it, Eric. No, Eric, come on.
Okay.
Do it right.
All right. So let's welcome our next speaker, Chuck DeLeone.
Yes. And really, thank you all for coming here. It's a wonderful chance for each of us to reflect on some of the legacy of Wendell and the things he's done, and also maybe to help move us forward in thinking about how we conceptualize what it is that we as a community study and do, and how we communicate it to our students. So my goal, I don't know if we'll get there, but my goal is to do two things. I want to talk a little bit about the course that Wendell developed and how it stands now, which is 20 plus years on from when it was originated, and maybe what we can take away from some of the things that happened there, lessons that could be useful to us. And then the other thing is, I'd like to move forward this discussion we're having about language. And this is Julie and I, we had a Zoom meeting, we talked on the phone about this, on the Zoom, and then we've talked about this in the past, and it's something I think that's at least worth us talking about more as a community. And that's why I'm so happy you're all here. So we can really move this forward. So there is an interactive piece towards the end here. Okay. Yeah, I love that picture. So yeah, thanks to all the folks who've contributed to this. Not up here, but who should be is Ed Price, who has to unfortunately listen to me when I talk about these things. All right. So what's the history here? Maybe this is just a quick chance to remind you of how this all got started. So I don't know if there's any program officers in here from the NSF. Anybody been a rotator? God bless you. I don't think this would have occurred without funding from the NSF. And so this was in about 1994. Wendell received some funding, he and Larry Coleman, to revamp Physics 5. This was the introductory course, again, for the biologists that we've been talking about. Why that course? Not surprisingly, that's the one that the faculty in the department said you can play with, right? Don't mess with the physicists, but you can have the biologists. That's something that you can mess around with. And he said, how many can I have? Oh, you can have them all. So this started as a year-long pilot in 1995. And Wendell at that point had some really strong opinions on what needed to be done and how we needed to treat this population of students with respect. And that's really what I think it comes down to. And like we've heard Dave say and Julia say, he was strongly influenced by this constructivist perspective. And that really has a strong connection to sense making, as we've been seeing. I think one paper that really influenced him was Osborne and Whitrock's 1985 paper. And so that was a very meaningful thing to him. And the other thing is his work with K-8 teachers. I can't tell you how many stories he had about how their work inspired him and how his attempts to teach them about energy. And when they finally got it, he would tell these stories of how they were like in tears. Oh, I finally get it. And they started crying. He was like, oh my God. This was like a really moving experience for them. And so I think that idea of sense making and really finally getting your hands around something and having possession of that was super important to him. And so being Wendell, he wanted to share this. And so what I'm going to tell you now is a little bit about this course he developed. And the title of this talk is Still Radically Reformed. And so I would claim, even now, this is not something you see in many places. So, again, yeah, at that time, I would call it the nascent PER community. There was a PER community. Joe had to run off to another talk. But, there weren't that many back then, and folks were just getting started. But he was certainly influenced by that. So if you put all these things together and you take it seriously, what we sort of knew at that point and what we know how to teach, what kind of course would you design? What kind of course would you build? And what I would say he chose to do it, and what I think I still have huge respect for, is he didn't decide to chew around the edges. His model was to do it all and do it at once. And so his model for curricular reform was really a big bang. We're going to change everything. And we're going to try and do it right. And I know this sounds insane, but I have faith. And I think that's kind of what pushed him through, because he really did change everything. When you start to think about the scope of this, it's like, oof. And again, this was at a time when you were really kind of going upstream in order to do this. So one of the things that many of you know, you may have heard this in the past, is that the course structure was dramatically changed. The formal lecture, where you had 200 students in there, was reduced to 80 minutes a week. And there were bi-weekly quizzes. So every other week you'd have a quiz, and that ate up 40 minutes of that time. So literally, at the beginning, the amount of time that was available just to lecture was simply constrained by schedule. So there wasn't some sense of, I'm going to lecture less. You just couldn't. It was just taken away from you, that amount of time. The bulk of the learning then was moved to these 25-student TA-led discussion laboratories that met twice a week. Total amount of time was 5 hours. And so that's where the learning was going to occur. And so this, when you guys heard about the discussion labs, the active learning, that's where it took place. And so this was, by itself, I think this schedule change was a really big deal, and trying to get this pushed through at that time was a bit of a challenge. Again, many of you know this story already. The content was completely reconceptualized. So it was organized around the idea of models, and the sequence was changed. And so it began with a scalar model, which was energy conservation. And so that's the model that you started with. The content sequence sort of followed that storyline structure, where things were grouped by their functional similarity as opposed to, hey, this is just what comes next. So fluid flow with friction. Right after that came electrical current flow, because it was the same functional model. And so that's the way actually the course was designed. And then he went ahead and said explicitly, there's things we're just not going to get to. So the reduced rate of coverage. We're going to spend more time on stuff, but we may not get to your favorite topic. So there were changes to how problem solving was conceived, and we've already heard wonderful talks about that. I think, David, your talk was really nice, and so I don't think I need to say anything else about that. But how problem solving, how the students went about it, was completely reconceptualized. And he introduced new representations. That's a picture of him there using an energy interaction diagram. And so that was a representation that he found very useful. So to him, the idea of using representations as part of your model was a really critical thing there. And I'll say some more about that towards the end. And of course, more conceptual problems were introduced into the course. Students say, hey, are you doing conceptual stuff, or are you doing numerical stuff, or whatever it is? And it's like, when you hear that, you're like, oh, you don't get it yet. You're trying to make sense of things. But they still say that, And this is something that we're going to hear about. So I'm not going to say that much about this either, because in about a few minutes here, we're going to hear Cassandra talk about this. But he completely reconceptualized assessment, too. He said it should be lower stakes. You should do it more often. And it's not good enough just to stick a number on there. You should develop a rubric and hand that to the students, too, that allows them to know precisely where it is that they went wrong in the solving process. Just the idea makes me tired. It's just, you think about it, you're like, oh, that's like a significant amount of effort there. But that's nonetheless what he required. And so we like people to do. Formal lab reports were eliminated completely. So you're in a discussion lab, but you weren't turning in a formal lab report. And what was incentivized instead was attendance and participation. He wanted you to talk and be a part of what was going on in there. And that's where things went to. Just a quick comment. The reason the lab reports were eliminated, he said, these are biologists. They're going to get beat over the head in chemistry, and they're going to get beat over the head in their biology classes on how to do a lab report. They don't need me to do that. That's not a place for this particular course. Okay, good. If you're going to do this, you need a herd of TAs, right? Because they're really doing the teaching here. And so this was another area where I think he didn't have a choice. Graduate student and TA professional development became incredibly important, because what they were doing now was not sitting there while the students went through a menu-driven laboratory. They were actually facilitating active learning, which then became something that the group cared about. I mean, it's like you had to think, hey, how do I go in there and help encourage the students to get up and use a whiteboard and have discussions and moderate that?
And so this is something we'll talk about, but I think this had a real effect on future faculty. Yes, and this was flipped classroom before flipped classroom was a word. This is what this was. Because it was all emphasized on active learning. And we've heard a little bit about that already, and we'll hear some more. The students would get together in a group, they'd work on answering some prompts, they would produce an answer on a whiteboard, and then they'd be asked to present out to the class. And so I want to say this here, but it's like another one of these things, you like think back on it, you're like, oh my God, what was he thinking? But there's an area there where there was an explicit emphasis on scientific discourse, how to carry out argumentation. And that's what we all just did. So when Julie asked that question, what were we doing? Oh, we were carrying out scientific discourse. We were making arguments with each other about what the heck the answer should be based on blah, But how do you do that? And that's one of the most important things that we teach our students. And so this is something that came up because it was expected to occur inside the discussion labs. And one of the outgrowths of that was that for 5 years or so we ran a workshop on facilitating active learning. Okay, good. And of course there was the changes to the course materials. We saw a picture of that book, but for the longest time there was like no book, right? Okay, so who can answer this question? They're biologists. Why did he take away the book? At the very beginning there was no textbook for this. It was a set of notes. They weren't very useful. They were only good after you learned the course. They literally weren't very useful. They were good once you understood what was going on. But here's a question to y'all. Why did he take away the book? If you're a biologist, what do you do with a book?
Memorize it.
Say it again, Eric.
Memorize it.
Yeah, that's what you do. And that's literally what he didn't want. I mean, his worry was that if you gave them the book, they would sit there and actually read it, which was wrong. We don't want them to read the book, right? We want you to do physics, We don't want you reading the book, So he actually saw that as a crutch or something that they would end up memorizing. And so he had completely eliminated and gave this totally useless set of notes. It was only good after you had figured out what was going on. Then you would go, oh, I get it. That's what's in here. So you literally had to tell them that it's not for reading, But for that population, that was the idea. And again, a lot of those discussion labs were developed from scratch. Again, the scope of this course, I was going to say that I think this was different for that time too. This was not a boutique deal here. This was David's nodding his head because it was not a boutique. This was 1,200 students a year. So this was like, okay, we're not doing the one little section here that we can have fun with and play with, and this is our little world. No, we're responsible for all of them. And so this was a big deal. This was all sections of the course were changed. And so it was a huge manpower effort.
Right from the beginning?
No, we had 1 year of pilot, which was insane, because we knew that next year was like a train coming at you, that was going to have to. And then, you knew you were going to do it. You'd be in the soup. Okay, so this is me now thinking about Wendell, and I'm sure he's like rolling over right now going, what does he say? It's not. So why did he do these things? And I want to say that I think the first reason was that this was an ethical imperative for him. This was like a medical study where we knew the answer already. It's like, if you know that what you're doing is something that saves lives, then why aren't we doing it for everybody? And I think that's one of the reasons that he did it. He had a good sense of what was possible, and then he literally committed to doing it. He had a lot of credibility in the department, and the credibility he had in the department was because he worked his tail off. He was the vice chair of the department, and then the vice chair for undergraduate education, and he worked so hard at it. I think people said, "Sure, whatever you want to do, I mean, go ahead." And so he had built up that credibility so that he was in a place where he could actually do this. And then he worked tirelessly at promoting and justifying the course. I remember a study he did for the biology department because they'd had some complaints on it, and literally the study took him, I want to say 4 months, to put together a paper, to present to the dean over there and the rest of them, to internally justify what's going on here. And they bought it. It was good because he had data everything. But that was not zero amount of work. That was a huge amount of work. And then the courses won awards and other things like that. So he worked to make sure that it would survive, and that was a huge amount of effort. So what can we say about class? Now, David, anything, you can contradict anything I say here, but But this is this is what I would say about this course 20 years on. It's tens of thousands of students now who've gone through it. It's been disseminated. It's gone to other places. But this is one thing. When you're doing PR, this is not your ideal circumstance because you've changed everything at once. You've done it for an ethical reason. But when you change everything at once, it makes it very difficult to study. And so this is one of those things that he kind of fell into. So for those of you who are like, thinking, you got to think about these things. I think the course put Wendell and the Davis Group a little bit outside the mainstream here. And one reason is that, if you looked at the instruments that we had available back then, it was like, the FCI, FMCE is like, hey, what's your FCI score? I don't know. Eric, what's your FCI score? I don't know. Let me check. Let me see. Oh, hey, I got a high FCI score, right? And this was a course where instead of worrying about that tool and satisfying and doing better on a particular metric like that, he'd actually gone ahead and said, oh, we're spending less time on mechanics. You could go ahead and do the FCI, but we're going to spend more time and energy and less on mechanics. And so I think this was something that came into it. The course was disseminated. We do it down at Cal State San Marcos. We do it at some other places, do little versions of it and things like that. But I don't think it was ever going to be widely disseminated in some sense. It's a lot. It's a lot to accept and a lot to change. We may get to a point where versions of it are widely disseminated, and I think we're approaching that. But it wasn't going to happen at that time, I don't think. But I'd say the most profound impact of the course was on the students and in moving the discussion around what was possible in the introductory course. I think that this course did that. It moved the needle in the PR community, and it moved the needle more widely on our discussion about what you could do and what it might look like. And I think, I've talked to Corinne about, I think Paradigms did the same thing for the upper division courses. What could it look like? What might we be able to do? Long-term effects. One of the things I think we learned, I think that structural change there, I would encourage other folks to consider that at your institutions. That's a barrier to reversion. It's hard to go back when things have been scheduled that way for so long because it's work. You're creating work for somebody to go back to what was bad. And so you're like, oh man, I'd have to go and reschedule? Oh, that sounds hard. Let's just keep doing what we're doing, So I think barriers to reversion is something that probably is getting some study right now and needs to get more. It's been sustained through many faculty changes. David talked about that already. It's funny, not surprisingly, the course had to kind of have a course manager. This is something that Chris Rasmussen at San Diego State has written about. It's critical to maintain courses like this, and this is something that it took to make it do it. It's been, like I said, it's been disseminated a bit. We talked a little bit about that. But I think the effect on future faculty and the folks who come out of it, I look at the knock-on effect of folks who've sort of been involved either tangentially or partially. I think it's had you can just sort of see how it's expanded out and touched lots of people. Oh, crap. Okay. All right. This is what Ed says I do. Okay, so here's the participation part. All right. Okay, so what do we do in physics? We do lots of things in physics. What do we assess? Quickly, turn to your neighbor. What do you assess in physics? What do you assess? I mean, you're going to give a grade based on something. What do you give your grade on? What do you? Yeah. All right. Okay, what do we assess? What do we assess based on? I know I only gave you a second or two to think about it. Algebra, yeah, I mean, if I were to say this, like, you give a grade on how well they can solve a problem on a test, right? Yeah. I mean, I think the majority of us, that's what we do. There might be a little bit for some lab reports, but we're going to give a grade at final exam. It's probably going to be solving some problems. So, I mean, I think that's sort of true. I think folks would argue with me, but I think that's kind of what we're looking for, when we look at those exams and things like that. Okay, so it wouldn't be a horrible thing to say that's kind of doing physics, right? Doing physics maybe is solving these problems. But how do we conceptualize this doing of physics? This is maybe one way to conceptualize it, right? It's like, oh, you learn some kind of model. Well, you do some sense making and try and figure out a model. You kind of got to put together in your head, and then you're going to learn how to use and apply this model. And what are you going to use it for? You're going to make inferences, right? You're going to answer questions. You're going to try and explain things. That's kind of what you. But first, you have to build it. You're going to spend some time working and talking with your colleagues and building this thing. What's going to be in it? Representations, some constructs, relationships between these constructs. You build it, and that's a functional thing, and then you go ahead and you're going to use it. This is one way Wendell and I might have argued about this, and then he would have said, it's not that important, like Julia said. But it's like, what do we do? It's nice to talk about. But here's where I'm at, and Eric, I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad all the rest of you are, because I think there's a problem here, and I think this is what I'm going to leave everybody with. What do we call what they do? You've got a model. You've sort of sorted it out. What do we call what the students do in our class? And I don't know. And lots of us use lots of different words, and the language is a bit confused. Is what they do problem solving? When you ask them to do something, are they doing sense making? Is it epistemic games? Where's Joe? He left. He had to go to the It's are we trying to grok? I tore his where? See? No, it's So are we grokking? Is the word modeling? Is that what they're doing when they're problem solving? Should it just be problem solving? Is it doing physics? I don't have an answer. Is it, one of the things, Julia and I were talking on the phone, I mentioned, is it model-based reasoning, when we're on Zoom? It's like, is that the word? I don't know. But I think that maybe we should care. And so this is what I'm going to leave you with, and this is why maybe we should care about this. There's two reasons. For us as a community, I do believe language follows thought. I think Agassi wrote some kind of book that had language and thought in the title. I forget what the exact title was, but
Minded Society.
Yeah, but there's that one too. That's right. I think language follows thought and thought follows language. So I think maybe there's a reason there for us to think about it, just so that we can communicate with each other. And I think over here, having a clear and agreed upon language is often the first step to making further progress. So that might be for us, although I'm happy to ditch it otherwise. Okay, if people don't want it, that's okay. We all want to do our own thing. That's good too. Joe, where are you? Okay. But second, and this is kind of important for me, is for our students. Because here's the deal. I think that all of us know that a good instructor is explicit with the students about what they're doing and what their expectations are. And the only way to really be explicit is to have a language that you can communicate to them about what they're doing. So I'll tell you, I'm going to teach you we're going to learn some models. Here's this energy and action model. Okay, so when I ask you to do something with it, what's that? Well, I don't know. Is it problem solving? Is it modeling? Is it sense making? And I think that can be powerful for the students to be able to say, okay, there's our agreed upon language about what it is you're doing there. And so I just offer you that as something to think about. Okay, and we'll leave some time to actually have a discussion about this. But there you go. That's one of my pictures. I think that inside Potter Hall, there's a picture of him like this, and he said, okay, I'm going to be cute. All right. He's going to stand next to the picture of him doing that. All right, thank you very much.
Chuck, enjoyed the talk, and I want to be talked in the hallway previously about this language issue, and I want to, because Julie's here, I'm going to pick on biology as an example of, I think, where we do, or I can do chemistry also, or pick areas of physics, where we end up finding multiple words for things that are in some ways close to each other, but when you look at the details, they're actually different from each other in meaningful ways, and for us to be precise about them, we actually need different language. So it could be that problem solving and modeling are actually quite different because they're different parts of the activity, or that sort of thing. So we might need umbrella terms, but within the nuances, there are nuances that are really important. And so I don't know if that's lost in the message that you're sending. I assume you agree with that.
I agree with that.
Then I need some more clarification from what you're trying to say.
I agree with that, but I think that there's a danger in becoming too specific and too detailed. And if we end up with every small element becoming its own private language, then I think we've gone to the opposite extreme of what you speak of, which is a situation where we've all developed our private language for the nuances of what's going on. And then it's difficult for us to talk about the global whole. And the reason I say that, I'll give you that joke afterwards. The reason I say that is because I think that global whole needs to be considered, because I don't think that we're as far from each other when it comes to what our expectations are for our students at the end of the course. So I'd say that, oh yeah, what I want you to know, well, we kind of agree. Like you and I would sit down and go, oh yeah, now let's talk about the language we want to use to explain how we get there. And so I would say, absolutely, I agree, but I think that there's also the possibility of us losing sight of the fact that we're all in the same group. Does that help? Yeah. More beer needed. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so here's my little joke here with the Wendell thing, right? So okay. Oh yeah, like Joe was here. It's like, oh yeah, well, there's a standard model. Well, what's that thing that you create when you look at just part of the standard model? Oh, that's just the model of quantum mechanics or the model of mechanics. Okay, you work your way down. Like, oh well, there. What about Newton's law? Oh yeah, okay. There's the Newtonian mechanics. That's the model. What about constant acceleration? Oh, that's the model for constant acceleration. Okay, what about when I solve a particular problem and I figure something out? Oh, well, that's a model for that particular situation right there. And so it's sort of like the turtles thing, right? The world is on the back of the turtle, right? Well, what's that turtle underneath on top of it, right? Oh, another turtle. Well, what's that on top? It's models all the way down. Is what I might say to Joe. But yeah.
Well, that was really fascinating. I didn't know anything about this person, so I'm learning a lot about what's going on at UC Davis. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just give them to you and you answer them as quick as you can or whatever order. So how did you convince the administration this was okay? Has this only been done with the biology students? Because I can just hear Sheldon Cooper saying, it's just biology, so who cares? I mean, that's not important. And then, did it work? Did it work? And you said it was hard to measure, and I'm wondering, can we measure anything? Did we measure anything about it?
I'm going to let David answer real fast to those.
Well, I mean, we've tried to measure things. If you change everything, you don't necessarily have a good baseline. More students passed.
Okay.
More students stayed in their majors.
That's what I was hoping, yeah.
FCI scores were plenty decent.
Okay.
We have a PERC paper on MCAT.
Yeah, we have what?
The MCAT.
MCAT scores went up a little bit in physics, even though we left out topics that were on the MCAT.
Awesome.
Oddly enough, I don't know what to make of this number exactly, but students did better if they took this course. They did better in their later biology courses, as near as we could tell, than if they did not take this course.
Sounds like you measured all the things I would want to know.
Yes.
All right. Excellent.
So it's the, as you mentioned the FCI and the mismatches, you're going to talk about assessments. So maybe this is leading, but is the assessment problem the same as the language problem? We can't assess it because we don't really even understand what it is. So how could we possibly start to assess the richness beyond bubbles on a,
You may well be right. And that ties in with what Michael said, by the way, Michael. That may well be what it is that it's really rich. And that it's operator. But, all right.